Hey there, this is Tulsa criminal defense attorney Stephen Cale. I'm going to talk to you today about the psychology of false confessions. If you saw my most recent video, I talked about police tactics. And one of the things I talked about was false evidence ploys and how that tends to induce false confessions. So I want to spend a little bit more time talking about false confessions. I didn't get into it in the last video. So most people would tend to assume that nobody's going to confess unless they've really done it. In other words, the evidence might be so overwhelming that it's going to incriminate them. Or a person might confess if they might get something that's more lenient, a more lenient charge, more lenient punishment. So unless a person has some kind of mental disability or there's been physical torture, it's kind of hard for most of us to wrap our minds around why somebody would confess if they really haven't committed a crime. So I'm going to go into that. Now, there's some general factors that can go into why somebody might confess. And those can be, some people are just more vulnerable to external pressures, especially younger kids. They're more higher risk of confessing falsely. As juveniles, we call them juveniles. Anyone that's under 18 is more likely to falsely confess just because of external pressures by law enforcement or some other people. Some people are just people that just like to please, and they don't like confrontation, especially if it involves somebody that's a person of authority, like maybe a teacher or a police officer. And some people may have some psychological disorders, delusions, depression, even anxiety or fear. Now, there are some strange reasons why people confess. In fact, I just read a federal case this morning dealing with a guy in Mexico, and he had a problem with the marijuana laws of this nation and of his state. So he's coming up on a checkpoint in New Mexico, and he tells the agents there, "Oh, by the way, I've got pounds of marijuana in my truck." Not a smart thing to do. He confessed to that. And the Border Patrol there started searching his truck. They didn't find anything because he didn't, in fact, have anything there. He falsely confessed. Not a smart thing. Now, his confession and interaction with the patrol agents led to some other infractions that were actually his fault. But that's just one example of some dumb reasons why people confess. Some people confess out of fear and stress. Some people have falsely confessed to avoid the burden of trial, even for minor offenses. Others have falsely confessed out of the fear of the death penalty. They're afraid they'll get the death penalty, so they go ahead and write out or make a confession. Some people do it for reward or out of stupidity. Stupidity, one example, like I just told you, the guy that said he had marijuana in his truck. When it comes to reward, some people have falsely confessed because they think they're going to get some kind of financial reward from a fellow, gang members, some kind of organized crime member. Some have even confessed as a joke or to impress a girlfriend. And it sounds silly, but in one case, an inmate confessed to a murder that he did not commit. And the reason why he did this was to prove that wrongful conviction is possible. Well, guess what? Yeah, he succeeded in that. Now, there's been a lot of research into false confessions and by psychologists and social type people engaged in that. And basically, you can kind of boil it down to three categories of why people falsely confess. And the first one is a voluntary false confession. This category refers to people that freely and voluntarily turn themselves in to police and they confess to a crime, but in fact they have not even committed that crime. You see this a lot in high-profile cases. Now, there's various reasons why these people will falsely confess to a crime. One of them is they have some kind of pathological need for attention. They might even have some kind of false guilt. They might think that they have some kind of tangible gain from confessing, or they might confess to protect somebody else who in fact really did commit the crime. Some people just have self-destructive tendencies, and that will tend to get them to confess falsely to a crime. I mentioned this happens a lot in high-profile cases. There was this is fairly recent, past few decades. I think it's fairly recent, but the JonBenet Ramsey case. JonBenet Ramsey was a 9-year-old girl. She was involved in a lot of beauty pageants, very successful at that. She was from Boulder, Colorado. And somewhere between Christmas or December 25th of 1996, JonBenet Ramsey was found dead. Her parents were suspects, but were never arrested or charged with her death. But the case went on and on and on without it ever being solved. In fact, it still has not been solved. But that happened in 1996, and then in 2006, almost 10 years later, a guy named John Mark Carr was writing to a University of Colorado professor who was doing a documentary on the JonBenet Ramsey case. And his emails and the content of them were so disturbing that this professor contacted police. Now, at the time, John Mark Carr was a teacher in Thailand, but the Thai authorities were contacted, and he was arrested and brought back to the States. Well, it turns out that his story, he could not produce any information that was not known to the public. In other words, there was nothing that he had to offer that wouldn't have been in the public media or in newspapers. Also, his DNA did not match the DNA that was found on JonBenet Ramsey's body. And then thirdly, his ex-wife told authorities, hey, we were celebrating the holidays during the time of JonBenet Ramsey's death, and he wasn't anywhere near Boulder, Colorado. So here's another example of a guy who voluntarily but falsely confessed to a crime, but didn't actually do it. And then another case from a long time ago, the Lindbergh baby kidnapping back in 1932. You may know about the famed aviator Charles Lindbergh. Someone kidnapped his child, his son, who was 20 months old at the time, and the kidnapper left a ransom note. Nobody could find the child until about 2 months had passed. A delivery truck driver found the child's body. But in that interim time, over 200 people confessed to that crime, and they had not actually committed that crime. So as you can see, that's one reason or one example of how people will voluntarily confess to a crime. Now, the second category that we're talking about as far as psychology goes is the coerced, internalized false confession. And this is an instant where an innocent person becomes convinced during the course of police interrogation that he's actually guilty of what he's being accused of. It's kind of an amazing phenomenon. Now, somebody may do this if they were under the influence of drugs or alcohol at the time that this crime committed, and so that person can't clearly recall what occurred when he was under the influence. There's even been some instances where even an innocent suspect who was not under the influence of drugs or alcohol is led through police interrogation techniques to believe that he is guilty, and he's simply repressing a painful event that happens a lot. And so you can see that some people who are under stress through interrogation techniques can easily be manipulated, that their perception of reality is wrong. There was an example of that called the Stephanie Crow murder. Stephanie Crow was 12 years old. She lived in California, and sometime during the night, somebody killed her, stabbed her 8 times. Now, the family members were interrogated by police, including Stephanie's 14-year-old brother. And now, one of the big things about this is the brother, who was 14 years old, was taken away from the family without the family knowing, and interrogated for a great amount of time, on and on and on. And so finally, this 14-year-old boy confessed. He said, "Yeah, I did it." And this was videotaped. And during the police interrogation, and on the videotape, you can hear this young boy saying, "I'm only saying this because you want to hear it." And anyway, he was misled. The police misled him, saying that they had physical evidence of his guilt. And so he was charged with murder. But later, he was cleared of this, and charges were eventually dropped because police found the victim's blood on a neighbor's clothing. But here's an example where, a young person, because the police misled him with false evidence and a lengthy interrogation, that he falsely confessed to a crime. And there's some others. You may have heard about the Central Park 5, a jogger case. That's another example. Now, also, people will confess because they just want to be compliant. And in this is called the coerced compliant false confession. And in this type of confession, the suspect's certainty of his guilt is usually the result of being pressured by the police. So this person will falsely confess to gain some kind of short-term benefits. Now, an example of that will be being allowed to sleep, or being left alone, or even released. So that person's gaining some kind of short-term benefit in exchange for confessing, and that person just feels actually worn down and just wants to comply. Now, if you or someone you know have been charged with a crime, and you've made statements to police during an interrogation, maybe even made a confession, give me a call. There's a way to attack this. I'm attorney Stephen Cale. Give me a call at 918-277-4800. Your initial consultation is free. If you made statements to police, I want to try to find a way to attack it and get that evidence excluded and thrown out, and fight hard for you to get this charge dismissed. I hope you enjoyed this video.